Well. I've got Andrew Frawley, employee number 2 of the Yang 2020 presidential campaign. He's got the photos to prove it. With it looks like he was working in someone's parents' living room with Andrew and just a few others. Also known for creating the math hat, I believe. So Andrew Frawley is on the show. But we'll get it started with the first Andrew, and then we'll jump into it.
There's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Pain, and Drew, come roll with the gang gang.
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds.
Welcome to the show, Andrew. How are you doing?
Well, I'm very happy to be here. I have to say, watching that sort of intro video, it was sort of like this montage of obviously many familiar faces, but it was just like I had this sort of light bulb moment while watching this. I was like, oh my gosh, this is this manifestation of like everything we'd hoped for at the beginning, which was like, you know, community leaders would rise up on their own and become these autonomous just value creators within the sort of like a Yang ecosystem. And I always knew that was what had happened, but seeing it on top, I was just like, oh my God, crazy.
Yeah, that was a special time. I think a lot of us felt like it was magical. And for me, oddly enough, when I watched that montage, Daniel Negreanu, the kid poker, the professional poker player, getting on the Yang train was awesome. Just because it was sort of like people from so many different worlds were combining around this guy who normally would never cross paths, or like obviously, you know, Fred the Felon and I probably in normal circumstances would not hang out a lot. You know, we live in very different parts of the world. We work in different industries, but we you know, have developed a friendship over you know, the last couple of years. So we are going to definitely get into the Yang presidential campaign, but just to set the stage, maybe we could just start with who's Andrew Frawley kind of prior to being, you know, the marketing director for the campaign. What was your story like before you and Mr. Yang crossed paths?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely an interesting story, I think, at least. And for full context, you know, there's a few things around this, which is like, I also think and thought the campaign was extremely magical. And I thought my personal story and how it related to the campaign was also magical, which is why, you know, I had made that tweet saying I'd been working on a book. I realized later the tweet was semi-confusing. I'm no longer working on the book. I'd begun working on it in June 2020, and I actually spent like probably 5 months trying to get a proposal or trying to land like a book agent.
Yeah.
And then obviously many other months writing it. I mean, there's like half a book written, but ultimately I just realized with the timing and everything that it wasn't probably like going to be a good use of my time to finish it. But the reason I bring that up is because a major part of the thread that I was aiming to put together in that book was essentially my personal story weaving in with the campaign because I thought it was so magical. For example, the title of the book was Imposter Revolutionary because I essentially had like no business being in the places I found myself. And yet at the same time, it was like this conflict of like, well, I had, you know, worked myself dead for like 5 or 6 years to be there. But at the same time, it was like completely absurd that I was in the seat I was. And so the story behind all of that is like when I was in middle school, high school, and all that, I had this great emotional implosion, and I inflated to be like a 300-pound kid. I played World of Warcraft for like 80 hours a week. I mean, I literally had like 500 days played, logged in to the game over the course of like 2.5 years. I ended up ranking, like getting Gladiator in 3v3, player versus player, if people are familiar with that. And then at some point in high school, I just had this mindset switch where I was like, man, I want to just, I don't know, just do something with myself. And so I like lost 100 pounds and like changed my life and became this social person. But the downside of that is I had many sort of like insecurities from high school, being this sort of like outcast that got bullied and all of these things. So I go to college and I join a fraternity. I didn't plan on that, but I was sort of like, you know, they sort of prey on vulnerable children, or not children, but like vulnerable freshmen who want belonging. So I got sucked in, and then I actually ended up becoming the president of the fraternity because for whatever reason that happened. And so that was like a strange place to be at age 20, 21. But while I was president, like I was organizing, you know, I was working like 60 hours a week on a fraternity, organizing like, you know, alcohol logistics and things like that. Sort of an absurd thing to be doing. But ultimately, again, I was like, wow, this is not the way, this is not the life I want to live. And so I started looking into like, what do I want to do with my life? And I started looking into startups, and I started looking into entrepreneurship. Specifically, I was really interested in like neurotechnology in the brain. And so I started like, you know, trying to change my life again, journaling, working out, like, you know, reading all the cliche books, you know, how to win friends, influence people, you know, learning how to build basic habits, you know, the sort of early building block, like a self. And then I heard about Venture for America from a friend. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the greatest thing ever. Because I was like, I'm not good enough to really go work at a big startup in Silicon Valley or anything. But this thing, Venture for America, it will teach me 2 years of training how to do this. Like, this is what I need. So there's sort of like some self-worth messaging in there that is, you know, distorted. But I went for it with my whole heart. I mean, I was like, you know, I had like a 3.0, which I had saved at the end of college with like getting Dean's List. But obviously when I was in a fraternity, you know, I was hardly getting any education. So Venture for America was like this impossible dream. And I had this friend of mine who had spent his whole 4 years in college trying to get involved in it. And, you know, he was like getting straight A's. So he was like, yeah, man, like realistically, like they pretty much just take like the elite cream of the crop, Ivy League kids. I was like, you know, obviously that's not me. So, but I'm going to go for it. So I write my heart out in this essay and I apply. And then my friend is like, hey man, let's go to New York City for the week, and I'll hit up the recruiting director because he knows them. And like, maybe we can like, I don't know, like network, and that'll help. That'll help you, I don't know, manage yourself or something, you know, make a good impression. So we go all the way up there, and I mean, huge day. It's like the most exciting day of my life. First time I've been in New York City as an adult. And we go into the office. It's like a dream come true. I'm in the VFA building. And I mean, I'm so nervous. I mean, I feel like I'm a total outsider. And we're in this meeting with the recruiter. I'm saying nothing because I'm scared, basically. And then she's like, hey, wait a second. Andrew Yang is here. And I'm just like,
whoa,
Andrew Yang, you know, and this is when he's like 9,000 times less cool than he is now. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the guy. And he comes in and he's just like exactly what you would imagined him to have been, like in a suit, no tie, like clean cut. And we say hi, I lose it. And I'm like, okay. And then he, you know, walks away. I'm like so amped up that I'm like, okay, I'm gonna shoot my shot with this recruiter. I'm gonna say something. And I basically say like, hey, thanks so much for, or it's so great that you're letting us applyees come visit. Apply-eves. And like everyone stops and they're just like, even my friend, he was like, oh. And the recruiter, she just goes like, you mean applicant? And like, I mean, I swear to God, sweat coming down my face immediately. Yeah. I couldn't believe it. And like a month later, I get denied from Venture for America. It was very sad. And I just wrote this like very sad, essay on my blog about how heartbroken I was. So the long story short, fast forwarding through time here. So then I'm all distraught for the rest of college. And I end up getting, a mentor to tell me like, dude, just move to San Francisco. I have a 3.0 out of Virginia Commonwealth University with a marketing degree, pretty unexceptional guy, but on paper. And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to drive there. So I just drive there. I have no job. I have no house. You can't get a apartment out there because unless you have a job, because the rent default rate is so high.
Yeah.
So around Denver, a friend recommends me to live in a co-living house. And I'm like, okay. So I look one up. I find this place called the Negev. And it's like this hacker house of 50 software engineers and tech people and entrepreneurs living in one house and just like being this abundant community, and you have to apply to get in. So I apply and I get in because I created a bunch of symbolic looking entrepreneurial things while I was in college and desperate. And so I get in and I move in there. And again, I feel like this is just like total imposter. Because the first day I sit down, there's this PhD in like physics and economics sitting across from me, like telling me about cryptocurrency. I'm like, what is that? But in that house, I actually ended up getting a job out there. I was driving for Uber until I found one. And I mean, that's a whole story. But I get this job and then I have an existential crisis because I learned that like a lot of my motivation to like get these great jobs was to sort of validate myself from that high school teen. And so I have this existential crisis and oh man, so many terrible essays about just existential angst during that time. But I ultimately come to this conclusion for me personally that there's like no cosmic meaning to the universe. And so I was like, okay, well, at the very least, we should just make life not suck. Like it should just not be a bad time. Like that seems like the only thing worth, striving for. And that's for all people. And so that got me into like mental health and all those sorts of things specifically. But at the same time, my roommates in this co-living house who, for the record, one of the rumors and myths is that Vitalik Buterin once stayed in the house. The founders of Soylent lived there. Like it was actually a pretty impressive crowd. But one of my friends there was like super into artificial intelligence, like AI safety. And he was like, dude, the gray goo is going to take over the world. We're all going to get turned into paper clips. Like the AI is going to take over and it's going to be terrible. And I was sitting there and I was like, before that happens, it'll take all the jobs and that will be really bad for mental health. And then I started panicking because I started reading books about that, about like mental health and jobs and work and labor. And I was just like, oh my gosh. And then one day I looked up the Davos forums, big global threats. And automation wasn't on there at all. And I was like, oh my gosh, no one's even paying attention to this. So this is what I'm thinking about in June 2017, when I have a trip to New York City. I actually had networked my way to a meeting with this guy named Gary Vaynerchuk, who's just like a media guy, if you're familiar with him. And my friend who had invited me to Venture for America to visit in 2015 when we were in college, he also he did get in. And he moved to Detroit. And so it was sort of funny afterwards, where he was in Detroit and I was in Silicon Valley, and he was like, like he was having a good time, but I'm like, living with these just totally savage, brilliant people. I mean, VFA provided that also, but it's sort of funny. But
Silicon Valley is not Detroit.
yeah, it's a different environment. So I'm meeting with Gary Vaynerchuk, and I'm like, you know what, I'm going to invite him. Like, he's always been a good guy. I know he would love to see this. So I invite him, and he's like, oh, dude, I have this meeting with Andrew Yang at the exact same time. How about I move back my Andrew Yang meeting?
Move back my Andrew Yang meeting.
We'll go see Gary Vaynerchuk. And I'm like, okay, like, whatever, that's fine. Like, I'll say hi to him. So we go see Gary Vaynerchuk. Very cool time. And then we're like, okay, I guess we'll go see Andrew Yang. Like, whatever.
There you go.
And
like your old buddies. You met him before.
Yeah, right. Incredibly, Yang remembers me. So I haven't seen it documented too much online, but like, that guy is, he's a freak of nature with names and remembering you.
It's so annoying how he's good like that. I'm the opposite. I can't remember people's names like 5 minutes later. Yeah.
Dude,
he's super impressive.
I could monologue how smart that guy is. I mean, I traveled with him for the first 9 months of the campaign. It was like this guy is a fucking freak of nature.
He's a machine.
He reads books in like an hour, and he remembers everything like months later. But so we go to see Yang, and he's clearly like done with VFA mentally. He's no longer wearing the suit. He's in like a wife beater on a Friday. And
hopefully he didn't have cargo shorts and flip flops.
No, he still had like jeans on. But so I'm like, okay. Oh geez, hold on. I think it's time. Sorry, we have groceries getting delivered. And so yeah, so we sit down with him, and he's just like, yeah, I have this big project coming up, and he starts talking about automation and robots and like a new economy, and I'm just like, what are you saying? Like, where did you come from? Like, this is crazy. So I lose it in the meeting, and it's a funny contrast because, I just can't believe it. I can't talk 2 years later, and then now in 2017, I've obviously done immense work to like verse myself over these years since the fraternities, but I mean, I'm just rattling off data and statistics to him, and he's just like, yes, yeah. So I email him after the meeting, and I'm like, hey, I don't know what your project is, but like, I want to help. And he's like, yeah, I'm running for president. Like, if you want
That's
in,
the project.
like feel free to join. I'm just like,
if you're crazy enough.
And I'm just like, what? And so we get on a call, and he's like, yeah. I'm like, oh, I don't know. I guess I'll like put out yard signs for him, just to help. And he's like, yeah, like we get on this call, and he's like, yeah, we're building out the team. We think you could be a great like start to the marketing efforts and all these things. I'm like, what is he saying? He wants me to do this? So I actually don't commit because I'm so ambivalent. And I'd grown up in Washington, D.C. in a family that was definitely more conservative than liberal. And I grew up extremely apolitical. I mean, hated politics, actively, as a kid would tell people with absolute joy how much I would hate politics and I would never be there. And this was one of the themes I was exploring in the book, which is something I called like the invisible hand of political disenchantment, which was the fact that I had no idea why I hated politics at like age 14, but like, man, let me tell you, I did. So it was like a big conflict with my identity. I was like, I'm supposed to be a startup guy. And everyone in Silicon Valley is telling me not to do it. I mean, everyone I asked is just like, dude, absolutely not. This is the worst choice you can make. It's going to be the end of your career. Like, don't do it, man. Don't do it. Like, stay out here, build the future. They all built crypto. So, I mean, they weren't wrong. But so I actually literally was so uncertain about what to do. I moved out of my apartment, and then I just started traveling the country, speaking to professors at universities. I just like started going to universities. I would sit in on classes and just talk to professors afterwards and just be like, hey, like, here's my situation. What do you think? I went to like 7 universities, and I mean, I had this whole life tour It was very interesting. It's a long story also, but at the end of the tour, I meet Yang in New York City to basically like decide if I'm going to do it. And he had sent me The War on Normal People like 3 days before, and I read it and I was like, all ambivalence is gone. You know, he makes the case so clearly in there. I was like, dude, this is totally the move. This is what we must do. So I met with him, we committed, and then I started December 1st, 2017.
And up to that point, had you worked in marketing in a different capacity before?
Yeah, I mean, marketing had been my degree was in marketing. While I was in college, I'd received 2 certificate programs, one for like venture creation, which is like building companies, one for product innovation, building products. And I'd run marketing at a startup when I was in San Francisco. It was like a 10-person small organization. I was the only marketer, but it did cause me to sort of manage all the various components of a department. And I had done like a million things outside of like formal work, because that's just what startup people tend to do. I like built a burrito kickstand and like marketed it to the company that makes the burrito bowls at Chipotle, and into like product testing. And I mean, I was really up to all sorts of things. I was trying to like reinvent the tortilla. I had this like whole thing with burritos for a while, but yeah. So marketing had definitely been my bread and butter.
So what was that first week like working? Was it full time or part time when you started?
No, it was full time.
And was it in New York?
Yeah. So this was in his mother's apartment.
So you moved across the country.
I did.
Wow.
I mean, been living out of a bag at that point, but yes. Yeah, I mean, the first week was interesting. I mean, we had literally nothing going on. I mean, I got there and, you know, Muhan had like a early draft of the website. So we were like building the website. Yang just had like no photos of himself. Like he just had all these terrible photos. So I'd go like sleuth everything. Like I got that, you know, the official files from the Obama archives of him, Obama, that we used 9 million times. I mean, I actually felt, you know, the imposter syndrome was extremely real at that point, because coincidentally, Muhan was the fellow that I idealized when I was trying to get into Venture for America. Like when I went down there, the admitted fellows,
right?
Muhan was the one that I would look to and be like, oh my gosh, look at this guy. He's building like neurological apps for Google Glass. This guy is the most brilliant person of all time. So it was like a very weird experience being there with this mesh of people.
What was Andrew Yang like as a manager? Did you report to him, or did you report to Zach, or was there any org structure at that time?
I reported to Yang because he did not. Zach didn't join until like late March in 2018. So this is December. One of the things that I actually think Yang is great at is obviously managing, because he gives immense trust in you and confidence, which is, I think, one of the hallmarks of like a good manager, which is, and specifically, it's not, when it comes to management and like the general world of business, I actually think there's a under management epidemic. Like I think a lot of managers are like, oh yeah, I let people do their thing. And they just like don't lead at all. They don't give clear direction. They don't set clear boundaries. Like I actually think under management is like, is a big problem. But Yang would give like clear goals. You know, he loves, you know, talking about how he has like the clear vision and the clear levers, the 1, 2, 3 things to work on. But other than that, I mean, he would just sort of trust you to do your thing. And he, you know, one of the things early on, you're wondering like, man, how's this thing going to scale? And how's he going to deal with the fact that like all these people are like getting involved in his life and like speaking for him and all these things. And as we scaled over time, it was like interesting to watch him sort of look at people who are experts in their work, and he would just say, like, if that's, I hired you to do the videos. If that's what you think is good, then okay, like, that's your call, and we'll see how it goes. We'll look at the data, and we'll see, we'll test your hypothesis.
Yeah. What was he like when things didn't work out? I mean, you've got a group of people, many of whom had not run or worked in presidential campaigns before. I'm guessing there must have been times where you're just like, oops, that was not the right call. How did he handle those things?
Well, I actually write about this in one of the chapters of the book I've been working on, which is on my website. I published everything I've written, which is like 10 chapters. But there was this time, this is a funny story, but it created an expression that Muhan and I used all the time. So we were working on the launch of the War on Normal People, and early on, I actually ended up being split between marketing and just like being the scheduler and administrator for him, which is like not what I'm great at. So I actually messed up a lot. So I have a great, I'm a great person to answer this. So, I mean, at the high level, I will just say to directly answer your question, I mean, it's a pretty normal, I'd say, strategy, which is just like, give people trust if they make mistakes, correct it, explain why, a behavior is like right or wrong, aim to not make the same mistake twice. And then obviously if you just keep messing up, like adjust your role rather than be like, oh, you need to be perfect at this thing that we assigned to you. It's actually recognizing, oh, actually, you're not actually great at this thing. So we'll just like, since we were so small, we could be dynamic enough where it's like, okay, well then we'll just shift that task to this other person. Like, no problem for now, like whatever. You can't like make, apple pie out of oranges. So, but this story, we're working with the publisher of the War on Normal People, and I was like super stressed. I was traveling around with him and, whatever. And the publisher like saw me schedule a few interviews for him. And mind you, this is like April when we're like, raising like $18,000 a month. And we're just like, for the first time realizing like no one cares about us. And like, we're all like semi panicking. And so I don't know, I scheduled an interview for him at some point, and the publisher emails me and they're like, hey, like you need to check with us first before you schedule things. And like, if you go back and read the email, it's totally like normal and friendly. But because I was like so stressed, I just took it as like this like big attack. And I just like sent this email back that was like formal and professional, but it basically was just like, like fuck off, no. And and that was obviously a mistake. And then like I got a call from Yang like 3 minutes later, and he was just like, what the fuck is this? And he basically lectured me that he's like, dude, these people are helping us for free. Like, they don't have to do this. The publisher doesn't have to help us. Like, you need to basically, one, recognize that as like a strategic incentive for us. And then the second is like, that's the totally wrong posture to be taking with anyone. He's like, this is a campaign of warmth and love. And he was like, you need to be emitting warmth and love. Like, and it was so funny because he was like annoyed. So he's like, warmth and love.
Be positive.
Yeah, you need to be positive. Warmth and love. And Muhan was in the room, and he heard him saying like warmth and love, and it was kind of funny. And so for the whole campaign, Muhan and I always started using these terms like, this is like warmth and love, guys, warmth and love. And like, to Yang's credit, it's like April 2021, and he is still warmth and love, with his his whole ethos publicly, and I imagine even privately is still warmth and love, and I always think that was a pretty funny story.
Yeah. I remember my first interview with him on this channel, and I came out of the blocks with like a pretty hard question around like, Russia and Ukraine and I don't know, a bunch of foreign policy stuff. And I remembered distinctly how, it was not a softball question. And he was like, wow. Which I think in hindsight was a nice way of saying, like, what the hell are you doing, man? All right, I'll play. I'll go along with this. But, he wasn't like, negative at all. I was just like, wow, this he's chill, but intensely chill.
Intensely
Yeah.
chill. Yeah, I mean, the funny thing about working with him for that long is you really get a window into the true psyche of someone, and that's one of the things I've always felt just so grateful for. Is now that I've been on the inside of like seeing how a thing goes from like total zero to total whatever level we might call him now. Mm-hmm. Seeing the whole journey, seeing the inside, room and things like that. And then now I have this perspective of like, I mean, it's like one person, one organization perspective, but of like what the person looks like publicly, what the person like is privately, how words, let me think, or like what the person is like publicly and privately. And for him, it's actually quite similar, but seeing that sort of just like the translation of the true self to like the public self, like, I guess one good example of this is just like being a social person was like very difficult for him at the beginning. And he had to train that, or not social, but like he very much had to train to be this sort of like,
extrovert.
Yeah, this like extroverted personality, because he's, I actually don't know definitively, but I would say with like 99% confidence, he's definitely an introvert. And so it's just interesting sort of seeing that sort of work and transition. And then also on the organizational front, as a sort of separate thing, it was always so interesting to see how moments internally on a campaign or in an organization, things like things you were doing, strategies, how things would be like distorted publicly, or how people would make conspiracy theories on like what was happening, or like how things were being done, or like I remember in like 2019, people used to like post on the Reddit and stuff, and they'd be like, they have the greatest people on planet Earth working for them. And I would like look around in our like little New York Manhattan office and like, like living in squalor with like, just trash piled up. And I think we did have obviously an exceptional team, but I was like we are these idealized, like, heroes of humanity. Like this is like us. I always thought that was a very interesting life experience.
Yeah, I mean, it does sound like one of those cases where you have this team of folks who if you looked at it on paper, you would say, well, that's not going to be a competitive national campaign. And somehow, it's like, I don't know, there was this movie a long time ago about like an American Olympic hockey team that was made up of a bunch of civilians, and they kind of beat the Russians. And it was, I kind of see a little bit of that in the spirit of the Yang 2020 early team. When you look back, I'm guessing like a lot of startup people, we often look back on our startup experiences and wonder like what we would have done differently. Do you think there were any big decisions that you wish you could have taken back as, part of that marketing team, part of that early team, that would have extended the campaign's kind of viability beyond New Hampshire?
Yeah. I mean, during the campaign, I mean, well, let me think. Like right after the campaign, that was obviously like a pretty active thought. And like during the campaign, I always think about the end of the campaign, because it was sort of like somewhat clear that like we were going to not do well in Iowa. Like you're polling at 4%, a week before, you're kind of like, well, this is probably not going to go well. But I managed to live in like essentially delusion because we had just been such a magical campaign.
Mhm.
Like the book that I was writing had this thing called the meant to be checklist, which was just like this running checklist of like my VFA rejection, but then ending up there, and then, you know, all these like random things, like, you know, patterns in my head I'd created of like how everything was meant to be and it was destined that we were going to win. So I managed to, even up till the very end of like the caucus, be thinking like, we could shock the world with 18%. Like we could do this. Like they're not fooling us, right? You know, the same thing I think everyone thought. But I think I'd say that one of the questions that I often think about is, was it even possible for Andrew Yang to win president? Because it's like, oh, theoretically, like, sure, he could, but it's like, but given the structure of society now and the forces that control it and things like that, was it actually realistic that he would win? Because from starting at essentially zero where we were, it means he would have to traverse like every level of credibility. And I think about the term credibility a lot because I think that was like the deciding factor for us in like every rung of the race, which was like, if the media wanted to care about us, if people took us seriously, it was like, does this guy have credibility? And like, if you have zero name recognition, like the public, you have no credibility because name recognition is basically credibility. Like the institutions don't want to talk to you because you're just like this guy crashing their institutional party. And so I'm often like, was it even possible? Because when I do look back, I specifically look at the fall of 2019, and that's where we were basically met with this like identity crisis. Because what happened was we rode like memes and math to like 4% until like September 2019. But then we had basically stalled at that level for like 2 or 3 months. And the calendar starts ticking very quickly. Like by October, I was sitting there and I was just like, oh my gosh, we have to convince like a whole lot of people really fast. And it just starts to quickly look impossible. And you start to quickly be like, okay, like nothing I'm doing is actually going to get us there. Like when I would be doing merchandise, I'd be like, okay, like, is this shirt going to get us to anywhere near the tens of millions of people we need to generally convince? I'm like, like we should still do it, but like, gosh, like we need to start thinking about like things way bigger
moves. Yeah.
And what ultimately everything came down to was like the message and the identity, because that's like the product of a campaign. And so it just became clear that like literally everything everyone else was doing, like literally everything we were all doing was like not a waste of time. Like you need to do it, but like the fix is the message. But specifically what happened in September of 2019 is like we're hit with this identity crisis of like, do we keep doing what we're doing or do we change the message? Do we like change the identity? Because all of these things were sort of like all these things are like what we were thinking about. And like you have evidence for both. Like I always think about Trump, and he like never changed his message. Like that dude went from zero to almost reelected, literally just saying like MAGA and you know, like sort of like covert racism. Never changed once. Like I mean, like truly, stunningly, didn't change a word. But then, of course, like business logic would tell you, like, okay, you're reaching a new audience. Like you need to adjust, you know, your message. Like maybe like reduce the fidelity, or like, you know, shift from like logic maybe more into, you know, emotion and various, you know, things like that. And we opted to go for the professional route. Like we tried to change, and that's when we brought in like a ton of consultants, and we tried to like start playing the political game a bit more, which is like, once again, in my book, I sort of came up with this thing, which is called like the like swampy scorecard of like political bureaucracy, which is just like this made up checklist of like all the things you need to do for like the media to care about you, which is like spend a lot of money on TV ads, like visit Iowa a lot, like, you know, hang out with local councilmen. Like if you're doing these things, they're like, oh, this guy's serious. And then they'll cover you. But if you're just like not doing the things that they want you to do, then they're just like, oh, this guy's not serious. We're not going to talk about him. So we tried doing those things, and that's when, you know, Yang like stopped wearing the math hat as much, and he like got a cleaner haircut.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, we changed the message. Like we came up with a new way forward, which is I talked about the progression of this sort of thing in this essay that I recently wrote, which is like the art of slogans. It explores this very well. It's sort of interesting. The consultants came up with the new way forward, and it means nothing, which is funny, which is like literally what they said in the meeting when they introduced the slogan. They were like, someone was like, it means nothing. And they were literally just like, exactly. But their pitch was like, Yang is now influential enough that he can take a meaningless expression and give it explicit meaning. Whereas like math, we used a word that meant something to people to give us an identity. Whereas a new way forward, we could give that word an identity. And so that was like, okay, you have this literal empty vehicle, put in the new message, and that's when we, you know, new way forward. And it just didn't work, obviously. Like we didn't move up in the polls pretty much at all from there, which makes me just think it's like, I mean, was that message wrong? Like, I don't know. But I also think it's like, maybe we just stalled at 4% because, and maybe Yang's message at 4% and the math and all that was actually the perfectly right message. But what happened was that, like, if you literally have the institutions ignoring you, like, can you win? Like, is it possible? And like, given where we started, I just often think it like wasn't really that possible. There's another thing that I was exploring in my book, which is like there's sort of like 4 key opportunities for marketing, which is like paid ads, legacy media, marketing stunts, and alternative media. Like those are like during the campaign, I was like, these are generally the 4 major levers that we have. And like when you lack credibility, legacy media ignores you. Paid ads don't work because people just look at it and they're like, who the fuck are you? And I don't care. Like, I mean, I always use John Delaney as an example, but it's like, I think he's a solid guy. But I mean, he blasted cash into no man's land and got literally, almost quite literally nowhere. And by the fall, we had used up essentially all of the alternative media. I mean, Yang had been on everything. I mean, he had even been on like John Bill Maher, you know, Colbert, like he had been on all of those things, and we had done the stunts. I mean, $120,000 at the debate, you know, like we had done the stunts, you know, dancing and whipped cream and holograms. And like, I mean, we had done, and so I'm like sitting there at the end, we've changed our message. We've changed these things. What else can you do? Like, I don't think our execution was that terrible, that it was like, oh, that's why you failed. Like the whole time, I think we were waiting. I at least was waiting for our sort of like Pete Buttigieg moment where the media loved him, and yet it just never happened. And like maybe that gets manufactured. I mean, I'm sure Liz Smith, who I know you've invited on the show, I'm sure she could speak to how to manufacture that. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of my thoughts. And I mean, could we have changed anything? It's like, obviously I've thought about it. It's hard to know. Yeah, I mean, it was sad, but
just sort of playing out the startup analogy. Sometimes they say that a startup's path to success is just surviving and staying in the game. Do you think had the campaign remained active, let's say, through South Carolina, Nevada, maybe Super Tuesday, what would have happened? It's the same outcome, you think?
I mean, I have to say, I was also sort of shocked that he was going to drop out at New Hampshire. If he like did terribly, which he pretty much did. And I mean, I personally, I'd watched your talk with Muhan on here, and I was sort of similar to the Yang Gang, which was like, I was like, dude, we're just gonna hang on, we're gonna go the distance, and we're just gonna squeeze every bit of hope out of this. I mean, that's what I expected, but let me think. That's why. That's what I sort of like just intuitively was like, oh yeah, we're just gonna fight to hell, fight to hell. But I mean, the reason he drops out made complete sense, I think, which was just like, to keep running, he was basically just going to be burning people's money with like no chance to win, and like no one could have predicted. Well, actually, plenty of people did, but like, it's not super reasonable to have predicted like COVID taking over the world in March and stuff. Even though Yang was tweeting about COVID in January, it was still like just like a little thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, obviously, if he had stayed in, I think he probably would have gotten some relevance. I don't think he would have won. I mean, I just couldn't believe the amount of like. I couldn't believe how much the institution like didn't want us to succeed. I mean, the way I used to look at it was like Trump was the one that proved there was like a hole in the system. If Yang basically comes from nowhere and wins again, their game's completely over. I mean, it's like, I don't know if this expression sort of applies, but it's like, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me, I think.
Me. Yeah.
Right. I was thinking of George Bush screwing that up, and I was like, oh gosh, just don't say what George Bush said. but
Fool me again.
Yeah, so I think about that, and I'm like, dude, they just like, it was life or death for them, and if another outsider just like beat them at their own game, so rather than like turning him into
them.
I mean, I think it's primarily like the media and essentially like the major parties. And I don't like to sort of like paint them as like totally negative and stuff, but like the media obviously like did some pretty shitty things in relation to Yang. I mean, that's obviously well documented online. And it's just like inexcusable. And it's like, dude, you want to be taken seriously, like act seriously. And a lot of the media is like, oh yeah, like they think their job is to pre-vet candidates. And that really just becomes a philosophical question of like, what is the role of media? And clearly it does make some sense, because like if the media was like, okay, we're just going to cover everyone, then 1,300 people would be covered. Vermin Supreme would get equal coverage. But obviously there's injustice. Like Yang's sort of pulling at 5%, and he's getting covered at like
1%.
He's like the 17th most covered candidate. It's like, oh yeah, look at this guy over here, Steve Bullock. Like he once, shook a man's hand. So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. You still see that today. I was watching Morning Joe the other day, and Joe Scarborough is just befuddled that Yang is leading in the New York City
they're so
mayoral
salty.
campaign.
They're so salty about the mayoral
Yeah.
campaign. Oh my gosh.
Like they feel offended that he's number one. It's like, what's your deal?
It's unbelievable. I mean, one of the things I couldn't believe is like, I thought early on, I just did not predict the media ignoring him as much as they did during the presidential. I mean, he's obviously well-intended. He's smart. Like I just couldn't believe that it's like they didn't want to solve their own problem. It was so strange to me. It was like, okay, like our government's failing us. Like our leaders are like mostly just like, posturing and useless. And then you like offer someone up who's like wholesome, real, impartial. I just couldn't believe that we sort of like didn't win, which is like why I get back to the thing where I'm like, I actually think our original message was right. A real guy, like math. I'm like, early on in the campaign, I was like, I knew that we were going to contend, because I was like, man, I grew up hating politics. Everyone else hates politics. People just want like a normal person who says like real things. I mean, just the shower of platitudes we get in like the worst of situations in life is just like abhorrent. And I was just like, dude, it's like this guy is the answer, because he is so smart and yet so human. It's like the two things we all want. And I think many politicians obviously are smart, but they get like very marbled as they like get into politics, and they slowly just like their humanity sort of like decays. One of the themes I was going to explore in the book was like essentially the process of how, from my perspective in politics, was how like well-intentioned good people essentially end up standing for nothing and saying nothing. And like the high level is like half of them govern, like there's this central question in like politics and government, which is like, should the politician, are you voting in the politician for their own opinions, or are you voting in the politician to represent the group's opinions? And that like is a personal decision, I guess, in like what you decide to run on. And, you know, I read Abraham Lincoln's biography, and like he, at least in his like early days in the state Senate, his philosophy was like, I'm going to vote how you all want me to vote, not how I want to vote. And so that sort of methodology, I can't attest to like which one is better, but that to me is essentially how everyone in politics has gotten to where they basically just stand for like the same things. And it sort of actually makes sense to me, because like if you get voted into office and you're like, okay, I'm gonna vote the way I want, like most of the time, like people don't actually want that, because they just like get annoyed that you think you're like smart and voting, you know, if you're voting against the majority, basically, right? Because that's sort of like the distinction there. It's like you either vote with the majority or you vote how you want, which is sometimes against the majority. You're either just like you either have like sort of a cult of personality where you're like Mitch McConnell and they just sort of like love you no matter what, or you're just like a normal person and then they start to like dislike you for voting against them, and then they vote you out. So then the process sort of like leads to just a bunch of people who vote as to what the majority wants, and then the majority is pretty similar in each state. So you just have a bunch of people who all sort of just like focus group, and that informs what they say. And so that's how like everyone comes to just like have no opinions. So yeah, I mean, I always thought Yang was going to be great because of that. And circling back to the original point, when I look at his mayoral campaign, it's like, dude, media is just so not about it. What has just struck me is, you know, like I said, I sort of always expected, because Yang was this original, smart, well-intentioned guy, that people would be excited and would love him. And I have learned a lot just witnessing his mayoral campaign. I mean, it's like so clear that like there's just such a massive distortion of character, and you can just sort of see the echo chambers of what people are being told about him. I mean, the amount of people who literally just respond to his tweets just saying they just like absolutely hate him. And it's like, how could you hate this guy? Like, he makes mistakes. Like, obviously you can have policy differences, but like, to me, and obviously I'm going to have a biased experience, but like, I think publicly he presents himself as like extremely well-intentioned and, you know, motivated to help many people. Like, he's not attacking anyone. I'm like, I'm confused. Like, how can so much hate? I mean, it's not like a little amount of hate. There's a ton of hate. And so that's been a learning experience. And I also study psychology a bunch. And I've also learned immensely about the extreme distortions that people make on experiences, and how, you know, people see what they want to see. And that's a whole thing that I won't get into, but yes, that is.
Yeah, it's fascinating, especially like with the primary coverage and now the mayoral primary coverage, a lot of this hate is not all coming from the right? This is within a progressive,
It's almost entirely within the
right?
progressives.
Yeah. And this is within the audience and a community that values diversity and inclusion. And I don't feel like he's getting that treatment. And I'm wondering, like, one elephant in the room is like, hey, this is the first time that an Asian American man has run for a big time office like this that I can remember. And do you think like that has anything to do with it? That it's just like, whoa, people don't even know how to process. Like, who is this guy? He doesn't look like a traditional Democratic politician.
I mean, it's possible.
He doesn't talk like them. He doesn't look like them. He hasn't been born and bred in the party machine. He kind of, to them, he comes out of nowhere. And they say that in the mayoral campaign. Who is this guy? Is he really a New Yorker? It's like, what do you mean? He's been there for 25 years.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's entirely possible that there's like a very unconscious maybe like racial thing tied to it. I don't know. I mean, it's really actually bothered me a lot just witnessing it. I mean, it's all just so strange. I mean, it's just like you can see this media machine just like pumping this agenda. I mean, it's outrageous. You know, the whole thing with the Tim boots. I mean, it was like Andrew Yang laughs at women being choked, and it's like this is why people don't trust the media. It's like when you see the full context of it, it's like,
yeah.
So
what's your take on politics now? Was this your kind of adventure in working in political campaigns, and you're like, God, it was great, I did my part, but I don't want to be in that world again? Or are you thinking like, what are you thinking about what's next for you?
Yeah. So before politics, I hated it. And then in politics, I hated it. And after politics, I hate it.
Well, you're consistent.
Yeah. I mean, it was funny on the campaign. I would just be like, I still mostly hate everything that goes on here. I think government's obviously important in policy. I love and things like that, but it's just ridiculous to me the way people behave in politics. I mean, it just triggers me so much. It's just so many. Oh, gosh. So I guess this gets into like what else I'm working on. I'll segue like through, you know. I'll do a throughway here. So I study psychology a bunch. And so psychology and philosophy, like logic and government and all these things. And so I don't know, when you're in the textbooks where everything can be laid out perfectly, all of the flaws of human logic and, you know, the Socratic dialogues, just like proving everyone wrong. And then you just like come onto Twitter and you're just like, oh my gosh, like I've never seen, like you couldn't design a worse environment to display humanity's like inability to like reason and process, you know, their own biases and distortions. I mean, it's just, So what is next is that, when I met Yang in 2017, I was basically looking for like the new system, the sort of like how do we, you know, with jobs going, technology and all these things, how do we build this sort of new system, or like what is the new system? Where are we going? What do we like? What do we do, man? How do we get to a place where like human beings are like being designed for and valued by the you know, the social system? And Yang had some good answers to that, but I don't think he currently has like the full vision. Like UBI was good and essential, but I felt like there was something missing. And for the first 9 months of the campaign, when I was like the administrator, I traveled with him and I met like an absurd potpourri of, if I'm saying that correctly, of people from think tank leaders to like Sam Altman and like little billionaires and huge billionaires, just all these people who were intrigued by him because he had these like ideas for the new system or whatever. And almost literally every meeting, I mean, one think tank leader explicitly said like Andrew, like this is speaking to him, but like Andrew, this is like the question everybody's asking, like, what's the new system? And so during the campaign, I also learned how one can obviously build sort of like a movement and national sentiment and awareness and things like that. But specifically within policy, like even though we were working in politics, like you're obviously monitoring how like the Green New Deal was gaining its traction and what their maneuvers were. And so that was all interesting. So after the campaign, I was just like, okay, like, what do I do with my life? And so what was here? So I knew I wanted to work in mental health and things like that directly. I never actually wanted to be a marketer. In college, when I was like a junior, I was like, I want to build organizations. But I was like, well, I'm already this far into marketing. I'll just use marketing to like go get some successes and then use that sort of credibility and clout, I guess, to transition into whatever I want to do. So that's essentially what I'm trying to do now. Like I love to write, so I was exploring a book, obviously, about the campaign. I'm going to continue writing essays about that. I'm just like not doing it in a book form, but I'm still going to share all the things I want to share at a gradual pace over the next few months. But specifically what I ultimately decided I wanted to do was, one, not marketing, and two was like essentially what's the best way to, it's sort of like unclear, but I'm basically looking to find out how we can apply psychology to government more effectively. And so like one of the things that let me think, the best way to present this is, here's the best way to present it is for this fall, for September 2021, I applied to a master's program at the University of Pennsylvania, which is for applied positive psychology. It's a one-year program. It's basically taking like the most modern science of well-being and it's teaching you how to apply it to like organizations, consulting, government, things like that. And when I had applied to the program, I wrote in this essay, I was like, yeah, so pretty much what I want to do is I want to build like the higher echelon of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs into society. So it's like, I referenced this thing that I called like the conveyor belt of material wealth, which is just like this perfect system we've built out for people from like cradle to birth to like go to high school, go to college, get married, get like a golden retriever, get married, get a nice house with a white picket fence and work your 9 to 5. That system's obviously not accessible to all by any means, but like the grooves are there. It exists in society. That's the thing you can like easily do. But we've never really even begun to conceive how we can design the infrastructure and sort of incentives of society for like actual true well-being. So on the side of writing the book, I've been studying, like I said, psychology, government, and all these things for the last year. I mean, I just full-time, just hanging out all by myself, just doing these things at a pretty rapid pace. And so I'm essentially reviewing like, okay, like what is like the empirical scientifically supported data on like what is well-being, like how do we get there, what are the policies to get there, and like how can we build a system for this. And I'm obviously influenced heavily by like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and more specifically Scott Barry Kaufman's sailboat metaphor, which is like a more modern version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so I'm essentially trying to move in that direction, which is like, how can we converge like an economic system and a government system with like the full spectrum of like scientifically supported empirical values of like what makes a life well lived. Like Maslow is obviously super popular, but like one of the interesting things is, you know, the way he always termed it was like, after someone eats food and that need, that basic human need is satiated. Actually, the best way to put this is like, if someone is super hungry, they have found like scientifically through studies that if someone is hungry, if you ask them what their utopia is, like they'll tell you it's a place with food. It's just like abundance of food, just all their favorites. That's it. But like once they've eaten, you know, that need satiates. And then in like whatever amount of time, as Maslow would call it, like a new restlessness appears. And there's like an actual sort of like loose hierarchy to that. And, you know, a lot of needs can be worked on at the same time. But as society is like obviously reaching some sort of economic gains and prosperity and material wealth, it's like you can see in the world that there's this second level to the hierarchy of like self-actualization that like no one's even designed for, talked about, tried to optimize for. And then you can see that in the numbers, like the mental health crisis is obviously terrible. And, you know, I always think that's like just the craziest thing. You know, I look at, you know, GDP and material wealth and things like that going up, and it's like, dude, but people are killing themselves and more depressed than ever, which is like valid. It's, you know, these aren't like miscalculations of data. It's not people realizing they were depressed. There's like real data that is like people are actually more depressed. It's like, what is the point? If you go back to 2017, when I was like, you know, there's no cosmic meanings, we might as well have a good time. And it's like, if we're not even having a good time, like what is the point of all this stuff we're doing? So that's essentially the project. I mean, it's very loose right now because I'm in a educational research phase, but the loose goal is by the summer of 2022, after my time in this schooling program, I'll probably launch some sort of nonprofit to troll governments into you know, adopting some sort of tool or incentive system or something, I don't know, just to design for well-being more effectively. I mean, that's a super not well presented answer. This is obviously the first time I've really presented it to anyone, so it's not very coherent, but that's the direction.
Well, that's exciting. I mean, I think it sounds like you're trying to think through how we as a society can reconfigure ourselves for better outcomes. And it sounds like you're going to be doing some research to try and unpack that a little further. And I'm excited. I'll be excited to see what you figure out and what you learn along the way. Andrew, do you have time for some questions from the audience?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
All right. So if people have questions, go ahead, put them in the chat. Jeremy was curious, was there talk of a mayoral run as a plan B or other post-2020 things discussed?
Definitely not. I'm also just seeing all these comments over here on the side. Very sad. So I'm sorry, everyone. I just saw that this exists.
Oh, that's fine. Sometimes the nerd audience talks amongst themselves, so they don't. It's not always directed at us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, very sad. I would have loved to have been interactive with some of these. Some of the haters on marketing, I agree. I actually personally am not huge philosophically on marketing. I think it's sort of just a waste of human resources, but that's a whole thing. Yeah, no. I mean, there was obviously no backup plan. Yang is 9,000% a like burn the ship, like tackle this mission kind of thing. I mean, he used to say to us early on in the campaign, he'd be like, when reflecting on Venture for America, he was like, yeah, my plan was literally, you know, I see this problem, I have the solution. He was like, I'm literally just going to give this thing 5 years. I'm going to give it 5 years. put my heart and soul into it and reevaluate then. And then he did. And then he ran for president because he realized, after that, evaluation, he wasn't solving the problem. So definitely no plan, no backup plan.
Yeah, I mean, was it almost taboo to talk about that? Was it like, well, you never say those words like, what if we don't win? We just keep going?
No, I mean, it just wasn't even taboo. It just wasn't even relevant. I mean, I think there's obviously the interesting thing about our team was we were both extremely delusional and idealistic about our potential, but we were also totally aware that the chance of him winning was next to impossible, just given what especially early on, 2017, I was like, man, we might win. As I look at Muhan on the couch in his mom's apartment, I was like, we might win this thing. But I also recognize that it's an absurd statement. So despite all of those things, it's we were aware that we had a pretty slim chance of winning, but we also didn't care about what came afterwards because we wanted to put our heart and soul into winning. And it was we have a small chance, but by fucking God damn it, we're gonna try and make that chance come to life.
Sid was kind of following up on our discussion around the decision to drop out, and I heard you when you were saying, hey, look, we didn't see a path to victory after New Hampshire, was only 2.8%. And, we'd just be using people's money. I think a lot of people gave money fully prepared for Yang not to make it all the way. I did. I was like, look, I think the message needs to be heard. If he wins, fantastic. If he doesn't, he's pulling the consciousness in a direction that we should consider, and he's adding a voice and a perspective that is needed. And so if he doesn't win the presidency, if he influences the dialogue for the people that do win, that's still great. So for me, it wasn't like, oh, I'm giving this money expecting him to win. I'm guessing did you all feel like, oh no, all of this money, if we don't win, we're completely letting everyone down? Because that I don't think a lot of us had that expectation, or it wasn't like a requirement that you better win if I give you this money kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's super valid. I mean, as I mentioned, I thought we were gonna just go until they blew
the whistle. Right?
Yeah, so they really made us go home. Especially because I was sort of in that delusional camp where I was like, it's who knows what will happen? We can keep going. Who knows? But I mean, it's obviously a personal decision. I mean, I think, that's the reason I've been told, and I think I have pretty solid access to the real things, and there is no sort of secret sheet behind the cover, unless it's purely within his own mind or between him and Evelyn or something. Maybe they were just extremely burnt out. I mean, those things probably weigh into it somewhat, but yeah. I mean, it's I'm trying to think. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I mean, it's just I mean, who knows what was in his head, but as far as I know, it's I mean, it's obviously a bummer, but I mean, the decision, I guess, makes some level of rational sense. I think there could have been a motivation just to not piss off the Democratic Party by just going around and continuing to troll. I think that's unlikely, but it's possible that at that point he was actually thinking about the next move, and that was obviously probably hoping to be on Biden's cabinet or something, which, at that point, you're probably making those calculations oh, maybe if I make this decision, it increases my chance of this. And this is a 10 times bigger win than and if you're calculating the probabilities, I think you play poker. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's a thing. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely.
So you're definitely familiar with probabilities. And so he might've been making a probabilistic calculation on oh, well, the value of being on the cabinet is so extremely high that even if it's a 3% chance, it's worth, not continuing for this month and a half. But that's my conjecture. I don't know.
Were you sad or happy? How did you feel when it turned out that he decided to run for mayor instead of ending up in the cabinet? Were you hoping he would be in the cabinet, or were you happy that he's
I
a
didn't
front
think
runner
he was
for?
going to be in the cabinet. The day that I realized he was not going to be in the cabinet was when CNN put out that article saying that he was like it's like 10 people who might be in Biden's cabinet, and under like Department of Commerce, he was the only one. And I was like, okay, this is fake. Like, this was planted by Biden's team to make the Yang Gang happy when he gets snubbed. And so, yeah, then I was just like, okay, well, he's obviously not getting picked. So, and then when he ran for mayor, I was like, I forget. I actually don't remember what I thought at first. First I was like, okay, well, he's obviously going to win, but I was like, I guess it makes sense. I mean, if I were to speculate on, the calculation here, it's like he becomes mayor of New York in 2022. And then if you do that for 4 years, it takes you to 2026, just in time for the presidential primary after Biden's second term. So it's like, I don't know, what else are you going to do for 4 years? But I mean, that's me. He's not the type to probably make those sort of like, obsessive sort of strategy decisions. But I don't know. I'm like, oh, that sort of like works out pretty evenly, because it's like what one can wish that there was like an idealistic system. But I mean, if he's mayor, he's going to get to run this basic income pilot. I mean, that's like absurd. It's the biggest, probably most influential city in the world, maybe.
Yeah.
And so it's like, you have that guy there, huge credibility, super influential. He's probably going to do a great job. So like, he'll have a great track record. Nobody wanted to cover him on his presidential because they were like, oh, you haven't worked in government. And so it's like, I mean, it's a whole thing. But I will say, like I said, during the campaign, it truly was not part of his calculation. And when he says he was not planning to run for mayor during that just like wasn't the plan until COVID like ravaged the city, I think that's actually probably truthful. I think he really probably had idealistic visions of humanity forward, like gathering billionaires and running like these massive trials of UBI and like pumping, candidates into Congress that support UBI and stuff in 2022. But I truly think, he was like, well, New York needs help. And really, if he was not running for mayor, I mean, look, these other people running for office, I mean, are just, maybe I'm definitely must be living in my own little like Yang bubble, but I mean, they seem like extremely uninspiring and not the right candidate for the moment.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. And it looks like more New Yorkers agree with us than any other kind of candidate. So fingers crossed he pulls it off. I was actually, it was interesting. I was really hoping he would show up in the Biden cabinet. And then was kind of concerned, like, oh man, I don't know if he's going to pull off the New York mayor thing. I hadn't seen any of the polling data at that time. Pleasantly surprised on two levels. One, that obviously he's the front runner in the NYC mayor contest. But two, whoever hears about any of Biden's cabinet members, they're just like invisible. So I don't know if that would have been such a good thing for Yang, right? Like, what are they doing?
I mean, the only one I hear about is Pete riding his bicycle around DC. That's pretty much it. Yeah, I mean, that's like a pretty good point. I think
it's like everybody wanted to go to this party, and then the party is just kind of like this lame pool party, and everybody's just kind of hanging out by themselves. It's like, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't have gone to that party, and glad that we went to New York instead, Yeah,
and one of the big downsides of being in the cabinet is you just become extremely associated with how that presidential term went. And you don't really have pretty much any real control over how the presidency goes. like I think about Pete Buttigieg. I think that guy is totally in calculations. I think he's probably one of the smartest. He doesn't even play chess. He plays Go. He requested being the ambassador to the UN, I think, as his like role, and that was like public. And then he was placed as Department of Transportation, and I was like thinking about all of this. I'm like, man, Pete is so brilliant with his wanting to be ambassador to the UN, because it gives you a degree of separation away from the administration. So you're like less, you're like, I was literally hanging out in Geneva. Like, you can't really get mad at me for how Biden ran the country.
And like a Nikki Haley move.
Yes. And then he would also gain a ton of leverage by, networking with the international community for 4 years. He's this little small town mayor. So pictures with like, Angela Merkel, it's like, hey, this guy knows big world politics. So I was like, dude, this guy's so brilliant. Like, it gets himself, this good exposure with like zero risk. But he didn't get it. So I'm sure he was probably like a little bummed.
That guy, I think, is sort of like the Toyota of candidates. Like, he's going to be super reliable. He's you're not going to have any issues with him. Like, nothing's going to be super surprising. And I mean, clearly he's very smart. I often wonder about the Buttigieg-Yang combo being a pretty interesting team. But we'll have to keep our eyes on him. I'm sure if I'm in the Harris camp, you watch out, man. That's not going to be a done deal, in my opinion. What do you think of the 2024 primary for the Democratic nomination, assuming Biden decides not to run again?
Yeah, I mean, there's no chance that guy reruns. I mean, it's just obviously not happening. So it's going to be really interesting, that's for sure, because obviously everyone's going to be like, our minority woman should be president. But like, are people going to challenge her? For sure. How it's going to play? Anyone who challenges her is just going to get canceled, probably. I mean, people are just going to be like, totally hating that person for trying to challenge her. And I mean, she'll probably win. Like, you're vice president, you're young. When we were in the apartment, December 2017, and I'd never heard of Kamala Harris despite being in California. And we played a video of her on the TV. It was like me, Yang, and Muhan. And I think Muhan and someone was like, yeah, she's probably going to run for president. I watched her speech. I don't know where it was. And I was just like, oh my gosh, she's legit. Like, she's the perfect, sort of like candidate, sort of, if you're to like draw one up.
On
like
paper,
she's like, she's like this like strong, minority woman who is like, has progressive, like semi-progressive policies, but then also has like this sort of law, sort of cop persona, which I thought would like pull a lot of like middle of the road voters. Like, I think Kamala Harris manages to come off as like centrist despite being like semi-progressive. I actually don't know her policies like extremely well, but that's like the read I get. And to me, I think politics is obviously like just like 99%, your identity and your brand and things like that.
Yeah.
Like, one of the things I always laugh about with math was like, so many people in the Yang gang don't actually like math. They like the idea of math. And, when we came up with that, I told a friend who was like, dude, this makes no sense. It's never going to work. And I was like, dude, it's like, it's not about like, it's not actually about math. It's about like what it stands for. And the fact that we turned like mathematics into like a symbol of like a populist symbol, I thought was like just the funniest thing ever.
Totally. I remember even in a microcosm of that, when I started this channel, one of my two brothers, not the MAGA brother, I have a MAGA brother, but the other brother was like, "Oh, dude, you can't call it nerds. It's such a like kind of negative term. It's what people, bully people around." I was like, "No, we're gonna embrace that term. We're gonna turn that around." But I think that was partly inspired by the math thing. I think there was a certain audacity to saying like it is okay and it is cool to know shit and to be into the details.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what I thought. I mean, everyone on the team. I mean, I recently posted a video of when we thought of math on my website, in that essay, The Art of Slogans. And yeah, when we thought of it, Zach was in the room and he immediately was like, "It's the perfect term." He's like, "It's perfect."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it just hits you and you just know. And
it was also the perfect time, I think, in the world of like radical MAGA kind of like screaming and hyperventilating. Like math was like this wonderful, like, oh, wait a minute, there's another way. Like we don't have to just like, get all emotional all the time. Like we can just try and solve problems.
Yeah.
I was certainly very moved by that. I know we should wrap up in a few minutes. Let me just get to a couple more questions before we do so, Andrew.
Sure.
Any backstory on the hologram project and why it didn't necessarily kind of get as far maybe as you wanted? I don't know.
That's a funny question. Thanks for the question, Jeremy. Yeah, I mean, the hologram was like in the back pocket and talked about being done probably like 20 times. Like I will say, like one of the super wild life experiences of being on the campaign that, on our campaign was like, once we became this like sort of like underground sensation, it was really wild to sit in like a conference room of like 6 people and be like, what's next? And then actually be able to think coherently enough that you could actually produce another awesome thing. So that, yeah, I mean, the hologram was always discussed. We almost used that, so there were a lot of challenges with it, which is like one, it's just like a logistical challenge, because like the guy who does it had to like set up a truck and, it was just like this whole thing. And then, it was also expensive. It was like $100,000 to do it. So those two things weighed in. And then third, I think the real issue was that we didn't think it would actually like help us, because we put out the hologram video and like it was exciting to the Yang Gang, but it didn't actually cross into the mainstream like Yang dancing and things like that did. But by the time we actually had the money to do it, it was the fall, and we were like, we're trying to be the more professional candidate. Do we really want to, essentially regress into being like, the techno bro, right. From Star Wars. So that, was like the main reason. I mean, we thought about doing it in Iowa, like during the bus tour, we were like, dude, let's just like rent this hologram. And so we can have 2 tours going at once. So we could just deliver a hologram Yang to like random towns. I don't know. It kind of like, I mean, who knows? It would have been really cool, but yeah, we just didn't do it. It's very sad.
Last question before we have you wrap up with general thoughts. It seems like a lot of the presidential team has gone on to do their own things, and the mayoral team, with the exception of Zach and others, perhaps, is fairly kind of a new team. Is there, just any thoughts on the overlap, and was that ever a source of discussion, or did you think there were more presidential team members that wanted to be in the mayor thing, or did everybody just need to recharge, or how did that go down?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people needed to recharge, though. He announced in December, but like I will say, like when the campaign ended, I felt I literally was not myself anymore. I mean, I was such a shell of my own like personality. Essentially worked 2.5 years for like 80 hours a week. I really essentially just died. But there's like a small amount of overlap. I mean, let me think. Let me process all of this. When he was like preparing to launch for mayor and when he was like announcing, I was still writing my book. So I was like essentially not talking to anyone. Like I was not actively reaching out to people. So I actually didn't really, I'm just looking at some of the comments. Okay, I'm sorry. One of them just made me laugh. So I didn't really see how anything was assembled or really, reach out or see who wanted to do it. But I mean, there's like a considerable amount of the team there. And, I think one of the things that was like interesting was just, along the way through the campaign, like you could see like various members of the staff just like get like destroyed in the public eye, or just like people didn't like them and things like that. Most of them are actually like generally like well-intentioned and competent. Like I remember just at the end, like when I was doing marketing, like I obviously got attacked just all the time in like emails and things like that. People just email me and they'd be like, "You're fucking screwing everything up. Like change your strategy, do this." That was like obviously less public. It's not like the Yang Gang was just like hating the team publicly, but I'd say like most of them are like pretty competent people. And obviously, at this point, even though a lot of the team was like green, they're actually, pretty well experienced now, given all the time they spent in politics. I think the new team he has is like totally the right move. I know he's working with like Bradley Tusk, who had like helped Bloomberg, obviously like just reign king for 3 terms over New York City.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you're trying to win, and those guys are like total experts. And so I think they're in good hands. And I've seen some people try to draw associations that, like, now he's like in the pocket of like Bloomberg and his team. And like, this is like one of the things that I mentioned about like the interesting perspective of like working within an organization versus like what it looks like publicly. It's like literally Bloomberg probably might not even know Bradley Tusk is like working with Yang. Like the level of influence, like media's manipulation of like relationship associations is like almost always 100% just like total slander, because it's almost never actually like has any impact. I mean, it's just like is Bradley Tusk like bringing Bloomberg mentality to Yang? It's like, I'm not in the room, but I could almost guarantee like, no, like Bradley Tusk probably isn't even involved. He's probably like, here's like my team. They're super great. He has like really impressive, people working for him, like very progressive individuals, like the co-campaign managers, Chris Coffey, and I forget the woman's name, but she's also like super progressive and wholesome. Like, I don't know. So I think the team's great. And then there's obviously plenty of, like you said, Yang 2020 people there, like John Liu is the digital director. And I mean, I worked closely with him, great guy, big fan of his, and many others. So I don't know if that answers the question. I'm sort of just.
It does. Yeah. Let me ask you one more from Soldier, which is like, having been in the presidential campaign and getting some help from the Yang Gang for that effort, what do you think are things that the Yang Gang can do to help with the mayoral campaign? I get that you don't work on the mayoral campaign, but from your perspective, what were things that were helpful in the presidential that might be useful in the mayoral when it comes to activating the supporters and the kind of hardcore?
This is a great question. So there's 2 things on this that I think are super informative, and I wish like every volunteer knew, because it would bring them a lot of peace of mind. So one of the things that I found on the campaign was that people would take it extremely personally when like the campaign wouldn't like adopt their ideas or like respond to their emails or help them and things like that. And essentially what it's like being like an operator on a campaign that people are passionate about. It's very exciting. Like you want the passion, but you get like 10 to 15 requests from people like almost every single day asking like how they can help. And like, these are extremely exceptional people from like any range of skill sets. I mean, you have artists, you have data science people, you have technologists, you have policy people. And you're like, gosh, how can we use all of these people? 90% of the time, what happens is like all of your work is like consistent routine work. Like when you have a super overloaded schedule on these campaigns, like you're blazing it 60 to 80 hours a week. You have like zero time to like spend on, I guess like investments like this, which is like something that will pay off long-term. One, just because you just get so overloaded because the campaigns are like stretching budgets so thin. You get super overloaded, and then you also don't actually have like a lot of time to invest in. Like your campaigns are like 3 to 6 months normally. And so like what ends up happening is that you don't have like from the probabilistic standpoint, like you don't have like a great calculation or like return to make on like long-term investments. Like if you sit down, you're like, oh, I'm going to onboard this volunteer and they're going to help me with this consistent work that I have to do every single day for 3 months. Like the payout is not always super large for the amount of time it takes to onboard them and get security clearance and NDAs and all of these things. But that's in a world where like everyone actually followed through. What actually ends up happening, and it's like very sad because many of these people like want to help, and like you look at the total sum of like the 100 volunteers who want to help, like I'm sure a bunch of them would actually help, but what happens is more than half don't actually follow through. I can't tell you how many times in the campaign, like credentialed people, data director from like Data for Progress. This guy hit me up in like 2019. He was like, I want to help. We didn't have a data team. And I'm sitting there, marketing team with no data. And I'm like, okay, this is great. He was like, I can give 10 hours a week. And I'm like, hell yeah, that's a bunch of time. And, one-off projects aren't helpful. That's the other thing that I miss. Like one-off projects, like there aren't many one-off projects that you can just like give to volunteers. Like there's just not much work. It's like, oh, we need to post this thing every day. We need to run this data every day. We need to like take this email. Like a lot of the work is just like very difficult to just outsource to people who are not fully like wrapped into the system. And so it's like when you have people reaching out, it's like you need to plug them into the system to like really make it worth your time investment, to like onboard them, train them in the systems, get into Slack, message this person with like onboarding. Very hard task. Lots of time. You have to like give people clear instruction. Like it's very hard to onboard people, very hard to scale a company, like all those things. So this data director guy, I mean, and this happened like 5 or 6 times throughout the campaign. You would onboard the person, like you get them into the systems, you give them permissions into Google Analytics, you do all these things, and then they fucking ghost you. They just vanish. It's like they respond like once or twice, and then you're like, dude, like, why are you doing this to me? And it happened so many times to me and other people, because like what ends up happening is people are like, oh, I want to help. Like, I can do 10 hours, but they're not getting paid. So it's not actually their incentive. It's their idealization of like helping the mission wears off once they're doing real work. And so then they just like stop answering your email. And so that is why people just don't respond. You're getting like 10 to 15 of those messages a day. And trust me, like the staff like wishes there was a way to like help these people. Sometimes the staff like literally hires people to try and like, dish out all this talent. But like, if you're just emailing like the campaign manager, they're literally just like drowning. I mean, they're just drowning. And there's like, they can't even process how they could fit you in because all they look at is like a big scary task. They're already working 80 hours a week and you have like a 10% chance of following through. So yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing. So how can you help in New York City with that context? So unfortunately, that context is probably playing out with that campaign. I mean, I talked to a lot of people, obviously, from other campaigns, and this is like just how it goes in the in the game. I mean, the best thing to do, unfortunately, is literally just donate money and exactly what they're telling all the volunteers to do. Like, one of the struggles on the 2020 campaign is people were always like, you know, oh, like, we want to do it this way. Like, what about this project? And it's like, I can promise you that the campaign team has thought of like everything you're thinking of. There's so much context as to like the full strategy. There's so much nuance to like resources, allocation of team and talent, who we have, what we can do, like all the data, what the data's saying on like who to target, what to do. Like, people are always emailing you and they're like, what about this idea? Probably like 3 to 5% of the time, the things people emailed me thinking they had like something super original, like someone on the team has thought of it. And that's not to discourage ideas, but I'm just saying, like, it is like, people have, like, the people who are doing this like 90 hours a week, like full on, like they've probably thought of what you were able to think of with like zero context. So that's just like also like a reference point that like oftentimes on the campaign, like we obviously saw people who were like, they're ignoring me, like we're going to go build our own thing. And it's like I think the campaign has a responsibility to obviously like give some level of information, and we did fail at that at many points. But like they've like totally run the numbers, and like what they're telling volunteers to do is the highest leverage activity. And unfortunately, it's just like not sexy. But like I can totally verify like more money is like it's all the stupid things that work. It's like calling IDs voters so that like on, you know, voting day, you can send someone to the door and literally bring that person out to vote. Super high value. Ads, TV ads, unfortunately, massive influence on people's opinion. And so it's like money and calling people. It's just like the 2020 campaign. It's very sad. I wish it was cooler. But that's
I appreciate you keeping it real, Andrew. I think that makes a ton of sense. I remember during the campaign, a lot of people sharing with me like, oh, you know, that campaign is not listening to my ideas or whatever. And I agree. I'm sure you guys got a lot of unsolicited advice. Some of it was probably very good, some maybe not, but ultimately, if you were to act on every inbound email, you would not be doing your job. And, you know, in a way, like, we trust the team to make strategic decisions on how they invest, and you have a roadmap and you have a backlog and you have resource allocation, and you can't just say, oh, I got this email, let's just you know, change the whole plan today. But it's good that you kind of confirm that, and as much as money and calling and whatever the campaign officially wants volunteers to do is not maybe the most kind of entrepreneurial thing, it's the thing that's going to help the campaign the most likely. So, Andrew, thank you for coming on the show. Any parting words or asks or anything you want to kind of let folks know about before we wrap up?
Oh, geez. Wow. Let me think. No, nothing really. I mean, I guess if you're interested in like the intersection of psychology and government, I mean, reach out to me. I'm hoping to probably build some sort of community around that, very small down the road. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it.
All right. Well, they can find your website at andrewfrawley.com, and your Twitter handle is tweet at Andrew. And that's actually, given that your name is Andrew, it's fine. Or was it originally designed when you were in the campaign, or is it just no? It's you're the Andrew that Andrew refers to.
Oh no, that's been my Twitter handle before
you came and became part of the Yang thing. Cool.
But the shared first name was a funny experience on the road. You know, we had a staff of 3 and 2 of them were named Andrew. It was always
Andrew's already decided. Andrew's fine with this.
The funniest thing is he would always call me Andrew. It's like, you know, we all call him Yang generally, and even on the staff, everyone would call me Frawley, so there was no redundancy. And yet he would call me Andrew.
Yeah.
That was funny.
I remember there was one point where I was getting ready for Andrew Yang interview on the Nerds channel. I think this was after the professionalism of the campaign. Like there was a desire to make him more a professional candidate. And one of the comments was like, "Hey, you got to stop calling him Andrew MF Yang."
Andrew MF Yang.
And I was like, "No way, man. That is how I see him." Any rate, well, Andrew Frawley, thank you for coming on to the Nerd Zone. It was a wonderful conversation. Appreciate you spending so much time. Thanks to all the nerds who tuned in for the live stream. And if you're seeing this on replay, don't forget to like and share and comment below if you have any other questions for Andrew, and maybe we'll get him back on the show and do a follow-up episode down the road. With that, we're going to say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds.
Love it.